welcome to the second of three webinars that we're running from the RI Paths project. The second one is looking at, from a policymaker and funding agency perspective, at the question of socio-economic impact of research infrastructures. We're planning a session for roughly an hour and a half until 4 p.m. Central European Summer Time, which is Brussels time. So you can follow us for that time until 4 p.m. more or less. We're very grateful today to have a number of panelists with us, along with myself and Silvia Vignetti from CECIL, from the consortium partnership, and other partners are in the audience as well. What I'll do is I'll briefly introduce the panelists. I'll then give a presentation, a short presentation of the RI Paths key contributions, and also a brief insight into the online tool that we're currently finalizing, which is one of the major deliverables of the project. And then we will have a panel discussion for roughly half an hour, and then a chance for questions and answers with the audience. So as I said, my name is Alistair Reid. I'm Policy Director at EFIS Centre, coordinator of the RI Paths project. I'm going to moderate the webinar today, along with my colleague Silvia Vignetti from CECIL in Milan, who's going to handle the session, the question and answer session, particularly with the audience. On the panel, we have Laura Hillier from the Canada Foundation for Innovation, who's also a member of our advisory board. We have Jan Hursak from ESFRI, the chair of ESFRI, and also a renowned academic in the Czech Republic. He's also a member of our advisory board. We have Johan Klumpers from the European Commission, Director General for Research and Innovation, in charge of research infrastructures and industrial infrastructures. And finally, we have Fredrik Skar from the OECD, who has led significant work on under the Global Science Forum of the OECD on socio-economic impact indicators and other methods related to research infrastructure. So we have, I think, a very good panel of people to discuss the topics with. Just before I go into the presentation, just to help you, those of you who are participating, to ask questions and for us to be able to answer them. Here in the GoToMeeting webinar setup, you can see that you have an opportunity to pose a question in writing. So we'd invite you to, as we go through the presentation and the discussion, to drop your questions into that facility here on the webinar software. And then during the session of questions and answers, towards the end of the webinar, Silvia will invite you to introduce your question, introduce yourself and your question, which the panelists will then be able to discuss. We will, of course, make the presentation available after the RI Paths, after the webinar on the website, and the webinar will be recorded, so we will be able to share key moments from the webinar as well. Just a few words then, as I said, an introduction about the RI Paths project. So it's a project which started back in early 2018. So we're now into almost the final month. Well, we are in the final month. We're into the final days, in fact, of the project. Finishes on the 30th of June. As you can see, we have 8 project partners, including 4 research infrastructures who have worked with us in co-designing and piloting the impact assessment framework. The 4 partners and the piloting exercise will be presented in our final webinar of the 3 series of 3 webinars we've organized next Monday. So you'll have a chance, if you're interested, to follow the piloting that's been done by ELIXIR which is part of the EMBL structure, CERN, the ALBA synchrotron, and DESY, which is also a synchrotron type facility in Germany, ALBA, of course, in Barcelona, Catalonia, and CERN, I'm not sure I need to introduce to anyone. So in terms of what we set out to do, we responded obviously to the call way back in 2017 with an objective to help the European Commission and the research infrastructure community, including policymakers and funders, to develop a set of tools that would allow better assessment of the research impact, research infrastructure impact on economy and society. So I think often in the research community in general, in research infrastructures themselves, a lot of the focus on impact until perhaps the last decade or last 5 years or so has been very much on the scientific impact, which is obviously what the infrastructures are generally set up to try and address. But we're looking more broadly than that. Scientific impact, of course, is a key impact and feeds into economic and other types of impacts. But we're trying through this project to understand much more broadly the types of impact that research infrastructures can have, and research infrastructures of all types. So you saw the 4 partners we have in the project, which are quite different in their scale and focus, including ELIXIR, which is more of a distributed infrastructure. There are infrastructures in different scientific fields with different types of activities. So understanding the impact of such a broad range of types of research infrastructures in different fields is obviously a challenge in itself. So our approach was really to start from understanding the specificities of research infrastructures, what makes them tick, if you like, what's their mission, what types of research infrastructures exist, and also thinking about the life cycle of a research infrastructure, which starts from often long-term planning of a new facility, trying to put together the funding, particularly for the large European or international collaborative infrastructures. So it can be involving several regions, several countries, European funding, and so on. And understanding how impact can take place throughout the life cycle of a research infrastructure, from, as I said, from the design phase all the way through to a possible decommissioning or future upgrading of the research infrastructure. The work we carried out was, as I've already said, was in a participatory manner. We sought to engage a broad range of stakeholders, both from research infrastructure management teams, but also from the regional level, for instance. So we had on our advisory board, we had a representative from the region of Lund, in which there's a major investment going on in the ESS facility. We also had obviously funders and policymakers interested in how to improve the impact of the investments that are being made through public funds in general, sometimes with private, of course, as well. I mentioned the 4 research infrastructures we have in the project, but the participatory approach we used for the project was much broader than the 4 RIs that are involved in the project. And we really sought to mobilize, as I say, people from across the spectrum of types of research infrastructures, and also the range of scientific fields through the workshops we ran. What were we trying to achieve? Of course, we're trying to improve the state of knowledge, the state of the art, building on work that had been done in the past, both by the European Commission, OECD, ESFRI, other past projects. But we're particularly looking beyond codifying what exists and understanding what exists to really develop with the RI managers, stakeholders, funders, policymakers, a very practical toolkit or toolbox for impact assessment. So I think that's really been a key part of our focus for the work we've done. And I think also we tried to develop a common approach or contribute at least to building a common approach at international level. So Laura Healy today joining us from Canada. We've had contacts with colleagues from Asia, from Australia, and so on, from the States. So a very much a broad approach to trying to ensure that what's being developed here in Europe can be built on and used elsewhere, but also that we take into account best practice and ideas and tools from the international level. So some very interesting work being done that we'll hear about, I'm sure, from Laura in Canada, just to mention one country. The key contributions that we see we've made through the project include the development of 13 generic impact pathways. I'm trying to help understand the types of impacts that research infrastructures can have on society and economy in the broadest terms. We grouped those pathways under 3 high-level missions. So you can see them there: enabling science, problem solution, and science and society. And I think increasingly the last few months, if nothing else, have given us enormous insight into the need for high-quality research supported by research infrastructures that can rapidly reconfigure and realign work that's been done to support challenges such as the COVID crisis that we've all been dealing with in our respective countries. So what we've tried to do then is chart out those pathways with the help of the different stakeholders and RI managers that have been involved in the series of workshops we ran throughout the project. Again, I won't read out every single example here on the slides. It's not the objective. But in terms of the different pathways, we have, first of all, as I mentioned, under enabling science, we have 6 pathways, which again start from the relatively standard one that I mentioned at the beginning. So trying to improve publication citation recognition. And again, I say standard, but actually for many research infrastructures, tracking publications done by visiting scientists who come to use the facilities, etc., is not as easy as it sounds. So even relatively simple on paper pathways can be quite complex to monitor and assess. Looking also at things like employment, operations, and standardized procurement, so the impact on suppliers of research infrastructures, for instance. Routes through technology transfer and licensing. Obviously, a lot of knowledge gained through human capital, through learning and training, joint development of instruments and tools, again, often in partnership either with other scientists or with industrial contractors. Learning and training by using the facilities of research infrastructure, so both students being able to access facilities, but also, again, industrial partners or other scientists coming to use facilities. And then, of course, the impact and the potential contribution in collaboration with higher education facilities. So I remember when I visited the ALBA facility in Barcelona, I was on the bus to ALBA, which is just outside Barcelona, and sitting beside a young student who was doing part of her master's work there in that fantastic facility. So very, very concrete sorts of impacts that can be traced from the science perspective. In terms of problem solving pathways, so we have 3. So we have interactive problem solutions for the private sector, so industry, but also increasingly service sector, who will be looking to make use of research infrastructures, capacities, and tools and services. Addressing societal and public sector challenges. So I mentioned already the COVID challenge, which has obviously mobilized particularly research infrastructures in the life science field, but also in other fields such as data resources and so on. And then, of course, potential impact through specifically curated and edited data, so the whole contribution of research infrastructures, for instance, to the open science agenda, to reuse of data, to be able to make available data developed and done through work done by scientists to a broader community, for instance. And then finally, science and society. So thinking about the sorts of changing fundamentals of research practice. So setting common standards and common understanding of how to carry out research, improving that across research infrastructures and through the scientific community. Creating and shaping scientific networks and communities. So this is a key aspect. I think we saw that coming very strongly through the workshops we ran, particularly those led by our partner ELIXIR in terms of distributed research infrastructures or e-infrastructures, where the scientific community is structured around a set of nodes in member countries, and part of the impact is captured through really, I think, putting together and helping those networks to develop in that community at an international or European level to become stronger, both in terms of knowledge, but also in terms of types of partnerships and so on. Promoting engagement between society and policy. So again, you can think about citizen scientists in terms of the use of research infrastructures, again, sometimes distributed ones or mobile research infrastructures that are looking at, for instance, air, environmental, water quality, etc., that can involve citizen scientists. But there are many other forms, obviously, of engagement between the research infrastructures and society, for instance, through promotion of STEM-type education. And then finally, communication and outreach. So I think a lot of effort and investment is made by research infrastructures nowadays to get across the message to not only specific scientific communities, but also to the general public, to business industry, policymakers, funders, to try and get across the message of what often is very complex science being done that maybe isn't obvious at first instance. What's the societal impact of that? So the communication and outreach, being able to support visits to facilities from schools, etc., can be a very important impact in terms of inspiring scientific careers. A second aspect in terms of key contributions is we obviously, as I mentioned earlier on, built on existing work that's been done, and I mentioned the OECD work on socio-economic impact indicators for RIs. So we worked again through that participatory process of workshops and discussions with different stakeholders of the RI community to really think about the sorts of indicators that make the most sense, that are operational, that are not too costly, because collecting data, analyzing it, etc., cost time and money, particularly time of staff within research infrastructures. So I think one of the key contributions I think we've been able to bring out of this is to further refine that work on indicators, which has also been supported, for instance, through the work of ESRI recently on key performance indicators, a working group which I participated to myself, which again is a basis for a lot of the work that then be done under impact assessment. We've also then looked at trying to detail the most frequent types of impacts under different areas: human resources, economy, innovation, society, and policy, and then gathered all that learning and then tested the methodology and framework we've developed through the pilot impact assessment processes. I think a third key contribution, and part of that is again today's type of webinar, where we try to distill and share the results of what we've learned over the last 2.5 years, is then also in terms of developing a common language across the diverse stakeholder groups, a common understanding of what's necessary, what's possible. So I think sometimes we'd like to have different types of data, different types of indicators, an understanding of specific pathways, and sometimes actually getting there can be quite complex. And it's important that everyone from people working in RIs through the funding agencies, through to the policy making community and politicians who are making decisions on future investments in terms of research infrastructures, understand that the complexity of sometimes putting what sounds simple on paper into practice. That was my short introduction. You can obviously get a lot more information via our website, and we'll be sharing a final guide and document, which we're in the process of finalizing the layout on after the end of the month. So by the end of this month, it should be available on our website. What I propose to do now is let each of the panelists, or at least invite each of the panelists, to give a short introductory comment into the discussion. So first of all, I would like to start with Laura Hillier, who is, as I said, joining us from Canada. So Laura.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's been great being involved in the RI Pathways project as an advisory board member. So I'm with the Canada Foundation for Innovation, which funds research infrastructure at universities, colleges, teaching hospitals. So we're a funder of research infrastructure, and my team is responsible for performance measurement, analyses, evaluation. So we've been playing in this area for a long time, trying to look at how we can optimize measurement and performance data, our research infrastructure funding. And a couple of observations I'll just say from the start, and why I think this project is really going to help bring things together, is I think this lays out a clear set of pathways and sets more of a common understanding across different stakeholder groups. So what I've seen in the past is the funder is asking for certain data, the infrastructure managers are trying to make sense of what's being asked for by their funder, and there's a tension between trying to use impact assessment as an advocacy tool, so trying to seek more funding, versus trying to use it for an accountability tool and making sure that we're actually getting the value for our investments. So I think those are some of the tensions, that having clarity around the different pathways and more a robust set of indicators that are aligned with those different pathways will really serve us all well. Another comment I'll just make is I think this also helps us, because the Pathways project has looked at from initial conception of RIs all the way through to potential decommissioning. I think this points to the importance of tracking and measuring at various time points so that we can make better informed decisions. My experience has been that in Canada anyhow, large research infrastructures are created, and then there comes a point when they have to measure and tell us what they've achieved without the forethought of what was their initial primary goal or primary mandate. So they're being forced to measure things that don't actually really fit, and were either an afterthought or not actually part of what they were trying to do. So in that sense, data becomes challenging. The outcomes don't look as good as they'd like them to, because that wasn't the primary reason. So I think this really sets out a nice approach for us to think end to end on impact assessment of RIs. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Laura. I'll switch next to Jan Husrak from ESRI. I think your mic's off, Jan.
Okay, probably now it's better.
Yes.
Thank you for having me here, and it was really a pleasure to accompany the project for a while on the advisory board. I mean, I'm echoing everything Laura said on the importance of the impact assessment, and eventually I have to start with a kind of disclaimer, because I'm in a certain respect handicapped a little bit by our ESFRI view on the research infrastructures. The point is that we are neither a funder nor are we a part of the commission services, nor are we a program committee. So our straight access to funding is very indirect, and this somehow influences the way how we are approaching and treating the research infrastructures. In addition, we are also not, in fact, a body directly engaged with concrete policies, because our mandate comes from the ministers, and we are only advising on research infrastructure related policies. And this creates also some very interesting situations, because our composition is very broadly scattered, and the expertise we have in ESFRI ranges from real research expertise, which is assembled, let's say, in our strategy working groups, up to the relatively high policy level when it comes to the forum representation. And this is to be understood because it narrows a little bit down our perspective we have. The other point is that up to now, and we are still thinking how to let's say enlarge our strategic positioning. We are dealing only with a very limited subset of infrastructures, namely those who are which are of pan-European relevance, which are quite huge installations or very broadly distributed over Europe. So we are not so much engaged with single-sited national infrastructures, monothematic research infrastructures. In fact, this is something which at the moment I consider as a real bottleneck, because after having several discussions with a broad variety of something which we might consider our stakeholders, our partners, our users, I mean the users of our expertise, aside of the ministers, I realized that the position and the role ESFRI plays is sizably distorted from our understanding of our role, and we have to reflect on that. And for those who had the chance to participate either in the recent presidency conference or had a look to the white paper we have been presenting, it shows that ESFRI is now in a process of internal reflection, and we are really trying to understand how to proceed in order to maximize the impact of the effort we are doing at this very narrowly framed field. But coming back to the merits, to the project itself. So what is essentially very important is that this project has tackled the issue of impact with a huge enthusiasm and in the whole complexity, and this is something which has some importance because quite often we are trying to approach that, and you mentioned that ESFRI has spent some time in discussing the KPIs for monitoring, or how to let's say improve or fine-tune our methodology in evaluation. And if the project would come few years earlier, we would have a much easier life, because most of the things you have tackled in a quite systematic way, we had to discover, let's say, without having sufficient support and just scattered expertise and not even sufficient work power to do so. But just in preparing for today's seminar, I went through our notes for the monitoring exercise, and I discovered a lot of similarities, and still there are some gaps. So we will really use the results of the project for improving our methodology. It is also important that conceptually we are building up a little bit on the findings of this project in a bit other direction, because ESFRI is now advocating the role of an integrated research infrastructure ecosystem, which itself represents a value, because in some sense, and this is a sentence which starts to accompany me. I said that once without having a clear understanding that it may have such an impact or make such waves, and I said that this integrated ecosystem of research infrastructures has a certain resilience or readiness to react on any potential complex problem. And with the COVID crisis appearing, I am now quite often quoted with a sentence that readiness is in many respects even more important than impact, because in that sense, impact is already a very concrete, and this means a short or medium term asset, while readiness is the ability to react to something which will appear eventually in the future. But this is just to add another dimension to the findings you have reported and are reporting in your project, and which I generally find very, very useful.
Thank you, Jan. I'll turn to Frederick Skar now.
Thank you. I'm so very happy to be there, because obviously this is in a way a follow-up of the project that we developed at OECD, and many of the experts which were involved in AI PATH were actually involved in the building of a framework. There's a lot of commonalities, and this is very important, because then there is no divergence between the various frameworks which are being developed. I want to come back to a few elements that Laura mentioned, and which are really important. I think one of the very important impact, if I can say, of this tool is that it brings together two worlds which quite often spoke a different language, which is the research infrastructure management on one side, and the other stakeholders, the funders, the decision makers, the policy makers on the other side. Both had to understand what impact assessment meant, what would be reasonable to expect from an impact assessment, and that sometimes was confusing for both worlds. It was also very important to show that this could be a useful tool for both. Obviously, there were expectations of impact beyond science from the decision makers, the economic community, etc. But sometimes they were not reasonable expectations. So what that tool shows, is basically, this is what you can expect from an impact assessment. Don't expect more, because that will not be feasible. And for the managers of infrastructure that quite often felt that it was just a burden to them, it shows that impact assessment can be useful for them to help reach their own targets. As Laura mentioned, having a clear understanding of what are your, at infrastructure level, what are your objectives, your strategic objectives, and then build your impact assessment in function of your strategic objectives is the first step. It's a major step. It's the most important step, because then you don't have to disconnect your impact assessment from your strategic objectives. And I think that's reinforced in what the AI PATH has done. It was, highlighted in our work too. And that's probably a very important lesson at strategic level, which is trickle down, as well as having a common language. Now, if we go down into more details, I think what the RI path brings, in addition to our framework, because you had more resources and time, is to provide a bit more information on the pathways. So it actually strengthens the use of a number of indicators, which we also had identified because they were being used and they were sort of commonly accepted. But here you bring some additional strength to these indicators, because you show in more detail how they are linked between, you know, the production of knowledge or of goods, etc., and to the actual impact. And that, I think, is very useful, because it does show, it helps all the actors to have trust into the model, to have trust into the framework. Now, then will come the last and most important challenge, is to make sure that it is usable. Certainly in our framework, the most important criteria was the usability of the framework. Basically, the actors had to tell us, yes, we can use 80 or 90% of that framework without some additional work or with just slight adjustment. We understand what you mean. This is useful to us. Because your system is slightly more complex, it has to pass that test, and this is why you had to do a number of case studies in more detail. That is very important. Now, having a lesson learned from these case studies, I think, will be the most important step finally, because it has to show whether for all the stakeholders, for all the different type of infrastructures which, you know, would like to use a good framework, this is feasible to them. And we know that there's so much diversity in research infrastructure types that sometimes it is difficult to adjust. So the tool had to be flexible enough with keeping the same language, so it could be used by all the different players. And I think you are certainly on the right track, but I would certainly be very interested to know what are the lessons learned from the case studies.
Thank you, Frederic. So we had our fourth panelist, Johannes Klumper. Unfortunately, we seem to have some problems with connection from the Commission side. So we'll continue on. Hopefully, Johannes will be able to join us at some point during the call. If not, well, we'll find a way to make sure the Commission maybe can join us on Monday in the third of the webinars. So in terms of the trying to continue a little bit of discussion and focus a little bit down now on some of the questions that we set to the panel. As I mentioned at the beginning of this second webinar, I was really trying to think about the whole question of impact assessment of research infrastructures in the context of the policy cycle. So if we think about the policy cycle at European level or national level, it can be the budgetary period for a national government. It can be often, very often, the European Structural and Investment Fund cycle of 7 years. So the new one starting up next year, the current phase currently coming to an end. We can think about, of course, Horizon 2020 and Horizon Europe with a whole stream of initiatives and effort into research infrastructures of all types during the current period and new plans for the future. And one of the things we thought would be interesting is to think where, and it's the first question, where are from a policy making, and as Jan pointed out, he's not technically a policy maker, but he's very much involved in the road mapping process at the European level, which is again a form of policy cycle that we can think about. In terms of those of you who are the panel members in particular, but also those in the audience who are working from the point of view of planning the long-term investments in research infrastructures, what are the sort of gaps in knowledge that a framework like RI Paths can help plug, and that you would be looking to use in terms of either current or future investment decisions for research infrastructure? So I throw that question out to the panel. So any of the panel members can jump in first, otherwise I'll nominate one of you as in my role of moderator. So who would like to have a go? Yes, thanks, Frederic.
ladies first, I was saying.
Ladies first. Oh, sorry, ladies first. I didn't hear you. Yes, Laura can go first. If she's willing to be volunteered.
Or I'll be volunteered. Well, interesting question. I mean, being outside the European Union and having a whole different system in Canada, I do think that one of the ways the Pathways Project will really be helpful is to help, first of all, set the need for different RI or research infrastructures for a country, so we can look and see where are we, what do we have, and then try and plan forward. But one of the strong advantages, I think, with this international framework that I mean, I'm really excited about the interactive nature that the tool will take, so that it's going to be something that can be really explored from different angles. I think it could lead to a better ability to have some comparable data, comparable information internationally on where are different RIs at in different countries, so that each country can potentially plan better their own needs, knowing what exists around the world, so that we can make sure we're more coordinated, make sure that there's better integration, but also better, I don't want to say duplication or repetition, but you know, where we're thinking about a new investment in a country, looking to see what exists and how do we complement that existing resource rather than duplicating, and then how do we make sure we do, or we make our investments in such a way that, coming back to what Jan said, the readiness issue, right? So we have to be realistic. These things aren't put up overnight. There's a lot of thought that has to go in. So how do we make sure then that we create more of a global readiness using the existing resources that are out there? So again, for me, I think the end-to-end use of the framework is going to be really important, from the idea stage all the way through to when should infrastructures potentially be decommissioned, or rather than having, you know, add-on renovations or revisions made, how do we make sure that the lifespan is a healthy lifespan, and when should we pivot to a different RI to take over mandate of something that's maybe aging or failing? So I really see this as something that can help across that spectrum, making sure that we're making sound investments in these expensive and long-term infrastructures.
Okay, thank you. Frederic or Jan, whichever order you wish to do.
Yeah, so if you look at the cycle and the various steps where a decision is required, you see various steps where actually the framework can be useful. The most difficult one is the ex-ante assessment, basically trying to predict what will be the impact of a new infrastructure. And I think neither our tool or this tool is suitable for that, because both tools require data, and obviously you don't have the data when you haven't started the infrastructure. Nevertheless, once you have sort of a common framework, which is where all the infrastructure are using more or less a standardized system and the same type of indicators, then you can use by proxy, basically saying, okay, we want to develop a new infrastructure. We know more or less what a similar infrastructure does in terms of impact, because we have a good knowledge of what's going on, and we have several examples. And from that, you know, using, you know, planning our new infrastructure, we can have a pretty good idea of what would be the impact or the expected impact, or at least this is what would be the expected impact. So it's working by proxy, but once you have a solid base of data on existing infrastructure, you can infer what would be the potential impact of new ones. While until now, I think the ex-ante assessment was really built on soft sound, but from what I've seen. Then you have a series of decisions during the life cycle of an infrastructure, during the construction phase, when you shift to operation phase, and during the operation phase. The first one is on a yearly basis. Any management have to report to its board, and you can build in the impact assessment system on a number of regular indicators to show that basically you are in track vis-a-vis your impact, your expected impact. I have to, say a word of caution, not to merge and to confund performance indicator and impact indicators, because they are not the same. They can be identical, but they can be different. You may have performance indicators which have nothing to do with impact, and you may have impact indicators which have nothing to do with performance because they are not part of the objectives. But nevertheless, there is a part of the normal reporting, and you can build in your normal reporting a number of impact assessment indicators. And for that, for the management itself and for the reporting to the stakeholders, this is obviously a very important element. And it's a regular element, and it can build, the data gathering for the indicators can be built in the system on a regular basis to just inform whether you're on track or not. And then afterwards, at a number of steps, you have to make some measured decisions. Do we upgrade? Should we have a synergy with other research infrastructure and commonalities in terms of development of software, database, etc., etc. And for that, the impact assessment provides a really added value. It helps in the decision making, right? And then, as Laura was saying, at the end of the life, potentially, you can say, okay, maybe this is not having the impact as was expected anymore. And should we keep it? Should we decommission it? Should we transform it? It's something so it could have a new impact. For instance, moving from a really scientific production to a more training facility. So it's a different type of impact, very important again. That can be done once you have the information. So there is a series of steps where both the internal management and the external stakeholders have to take a decision, and that needs to be built on real data and not on substance. And for that, I think the tool is really useful.
Yes, thank you. Indeed, I think it's a good point that you made about, I think KPIs, key performance indicators, and that's the work Jan and both myself mentioned that's been done at ESFRI level, for instance, is distinct from impact indicators. But I think one of the things we discussed during the work of the ESFRI working group was that a lot of the KPI information, the data that can be brought in through KPIs, is actually a foundation for later impact assessment or for building up the sort of qualitative cases that can be quite powerful in terms of telling a story about impact. So I think indeed we have to be careful about mixing up KPIs, which are often more about ongoing management on RI and impact assessment indicators, but they are very much can be very much the former can be a basis for the latter. The other element we did here on the policy cycle diagram that you can see on the screen is that we put governance really at the middle, because I think that's the case for almost any policy situation. But it seemed to us particularly critical here because when we're talking about impact, it's not just about trying to get impact over to one funding agency or two or three funding agencies or 2 or 3 countries, depending on the type of research infrastructure. But it's also about trying to get the whole group of stakeholders involved in both running research in the research infrastructure, but also in terms of the broader societal understanding of the impact. And so governance seemed to us something very critical with respect to the research infrastructure policy cycle. Jan, maybe your view on these first 2 questions, and then we'll move on to the second round of questions.
Okay, not surprisingly, I am not disagreeing with anybody and anything which was said earlier. I particularly would like to underline and highlight the importance of having proper indicators with respect to the phase of the life cycle, because this turned out to be a very critical point in our entire evaluation, monitoring, landscaping, whatever exercises we are doing. I mean, this is something which is really critical. I would also like to go 2 steps back eventually and say that there is a general value of this exercise. I mean, I already said that it highlighted the complexity of the problem, because quite often when you speak about impact of research infrastructures, you obviously, speaking with scientists, speak about scientific impact, about the contribution to the development of science, about let's say something which the scientists consider already as something like a real impact, and it's still just applied research. So having this complexity structured helps a lot in the discussions. In particular, it's also important if I go 1 step back and say, hey, aside of research impact, there is socio-economic impact. And then the immediate question, how much money does it bring, or how much money does it cost, and what are the benefits in these economical terms? Then it's really very important to highlight that there are other benefits which shall be already accounted for in all the argumentations. And this is an added value of the project in itself, but it's the added value here continues because the project uses a language that politicians and policymakers understand better than the scientific language. I mean, just based on their education, quite often they're not really scientists by education, and the language which is used here in the project, the vocabulary, the glossary, I mean, this is something which helps to advocate the role of research infrastructures in much broader context, in sectorial policies, in outreach and overlaps to education, health, environment, and so on. And I'm back with my integrated research infrastructure ecosystem. But all the simplicity in principle, which I expect to be beyond this very nicely developed thing, this practical tool. I have a warning. I mean, evaluation, monitoring, assessment shall still be done by experts. I mean, this expertise in a pool of experts cannot be replaced by any tool, eventually with some artificial intelligence somewhere later on. But at the moment, one shall be aware of the danger that if the instrument is very user-friendly, it can be used in a very simplistic way. It can be used even as a kind of black box, and it can do a lot of damages to the system. So it is always important that all these tools are accompanied with a kind of warning or disclaimer that still there needs to be a lot of expertise, otherwise this tool may then lead to wrong results.
Thank you, Jan. I think it's an important warning. I think it's also one of the things we're discussing in the consortium, amongst the consortium partners, and also in the different sessions we had with the workshops we had with the RI managers and other stakeholders, is of course codifying common language. And I can see some questions coming in around such topics. So I encourage those of you who haven't yet asked a question to do so, because we'll soon switch to questions and answers from the audience. I think this question of common language, common understanding, but also understanding the limits of what can be done is extremely important. And I think one of the things we've been discussing, for instance, is to what extent this material needs beyond the toolkit, which will be an online tool, beyond the guidance documents, beyond the body of knowledge we've developed through this project and through past projects. To what extent there's also a need for initiatives in terms of training or advice to both RI managers, funders, and policymakers in terms of applying such tools. And I think in the discussion we had on Monday and in previous discussions, including at ESFRI meetings I've attended, the question of it's very difficult to, and we shouldn't be doing that. We shouldn't be, taking a very standard tool with a number, getting a set of numbers out of it, and then using that to compare one RI with another. So I think the question of contextualizing different research infrastructures in their environment, in their institutional structure, so the governance structure I mentioned earlier, is also extremely important. Before moving on to the next part of the last third of the webinar, I suggest I'll just give you an insight. I hope you can see this if I'm sharing my screen properly, yes. Give you an insight into the future toolkit, which will be available in the next week or two. We just absolutely really putting the finishing touch to it. We want it to work, so we're making sure it doesn't have any bugs before we start putting it online and available. So as I said, aside from the guidebook, which will be available for download from the RIPAS website and also from this toolkit that we put online, we will also have the toolkit itself, which, as Jan said, the aim is to give a simple introduction to a complex issue, but also to guide both RI managers, I would say particularly RI managers, people who are working from the RI manager perspective, but also potentially funders and policymakers who are thinking about what sort of impacts, what sort of evaluations I could commission, and what does it require from me as a policymaker or funder, but also from the RIs I'm funding to be able to set up and do in terms of collecting data and so on. So I'll just flick through. These are obviously still screenshots at this stage, but so we'll have, I'd already shown you earlier on the different pathways, so you'll be able to look through the pathways, examine more detailed information on each of them. So for instance, here we have the enabling science one. We have a short summary of what each of the pathways means. You can then get more information in a detailed sheet. We can then visualize different pathways. So here the pathway 6 on training and higher education cooperation, looking through the different steps, but also the types of indicators that could be used. So again, you'll be able to see which indicators we think, we suggest, based on all the work we've done, not just on our imagination, with the RI managers and stakeholders through the project, are most relevant for each of the impact pathways. You'll be able to export that as Excel or PDF files, so getting the information here. For instance, we have indicators from the human resource perspective in terms of activity, outcome, and impact. So you'll be able to look at the different types of indicators. There's then a relatively simple tool, which is really the aim of this is to help those of you who are thinking about starting out on launching an impact assessment, again, whether you're coming from the RI manager perspective or from the policymaking funding agency perspective. You can think about what are the main defining the main missions of the RIs. What's the main purpose for the impact assessment? Is it about, for instance, improving operations? Is it increasing visibility? The source of training opportunities, etc. Does the RI produce large sets of data, particularly, for instance, thinking about how different RIs, single-sited, for instance, are inputting data into new developments such as the European Open Science Cloud, and so on. Then again, once you've defined those different missions, those different impacts that you're seeking to try and assess, the tool will then guide you towards the corresponding pathways that are most relevant for the types of impacts and missions that you're looking to assess and understand. Again, in a similar way, we have insight into the different impact areas. So here looking at economy and innovation, we have indicators and pathways linked to industry, labour market productivity, innovation, and impact on the local and regional economy. That's particularly important for large-scale infrastructures or even medium-scale infrastructures in different cities and regions around our world. I was going to say Europe, but also Canada and beyond. And then the tool will also provide a number of reporting and analysis outputs. So you will be able to use the tool to generate a number of short reports based on the data. So again, here, looking at the sorts of impact indicators, you can see, again, you'll be able to download this from into Excel or PDF and make use of that in your own infrastructure or in terms of your policy making setup. So that was just a quick insight into the tool, which, as I say, will be online in the coming weeks. What I suggest now, I'll hand over for the last half hour or so to Sylvia to read the questions from the audience. So I think we have a few questions. I've got a few questions up my sleeve in case the audience doesn't have enough, but I think we've got a few questions already come in. So Sylvia.
Yes, good afternoon again, and thank you to all the panelists for this nice discussion. I see that there are already 3 questions from the participants. We have a total of 57 participants in this moment, so I invite all the interested participants to put forward some questions to our panelists in the dedicated section in the application chat. And I will open the floor with a question from Frederick to Laura. So I'm going to open the micro from Frederick and give him the opportunity to pose his question directly to Laura.
Okay, thank you, Sylvia. Hello, Laura. Hello, the panel. Frederick Levenbeck from European ISI. And just before I ask the question, I had a comment regarding what you said about regarding comparable information. I know that Alistair emphasized the comparison issue in this wrap-up. I know also that Frederick also talked about at length about it, especially in view of ex-ante assessment for new facilities that you may want to set up. But I just would like to say that when you use the term comparable as a comparable information, if you meant similar, I think it's fine. But if you meant as a comparison, I just really want to caution about it, because we have said that the ARIs, they can be very similar, they can have the same life cycle, but they have maybe a different mandate or a different governance, and then you can't really compare the information. You can just use them for what you need, but you can't really compare it, and I think it would be really wrong. So it's just a comment, and I know that it's needed for the coordination, for the integration, and for the usage of resources. Now the question is, I was struck by what you said, like, you know, you have an understanding, CFI has an understanding between the discrepancy between the policy decision maker, the policy maker or the decision maker wants to measure, and it's very usually a standards request, and what the ARI's missions or mandate is. And then you being aware of it as CFI, how did you try to mitigate or find a common agreement such that the ARI can deliver what is needed and not useless results, which might have, as you said, you may have not the right data to show with, or this doesn't look so good, because that's not what you do on the standardized thing. So how do you try to mitigate that? Yeah, thanks.
That's a great question, and thanks for clarifying as well. Your first comment is well taken. I think there's always a desire to compare head to head, and I agree with you that caution is strongly warranted, if not that exercise discouraged. I think though what I meant with the comparison is really looking at what are others doing, how can we do it, where are we in our life cycle, and how can we move forward. But given your question about how do we deal with that disconnect between what an RI might be intending to do and might want to measure versus what might be asked of them. At the CFI, we have 17 what we call major science investments or MSIs, which are our large-scale research infrastructures that we've funded the operations as well as some of the infrastructure costs or the capital costs. So for those, we've undertaken, as the funding rolls out, we undertake a negotiation to figure out what are some things that they could measure that they feel are important. So this comes a bit more to the KPI, and again, nice points made earlier about the distinction between KPI for operations and performance versus impact indicators. But I think, as has been said, there is room for overlap between those two. So we just try to work with the RIs to make sure that what they're able to measure, what they want to measure, is as best as possible with what we know our funder, the Government of Canada, will be asking for. And then in some regards, we help to make sure that we can provide the context when necessary, so that by having a suite of indicators, you can deprioritize some that aren't relevant for a certain RI while prioritizing others that make more sense. But I really like the fact that we have, you know, the suites of indicators, which was part of the OECD project, part of our IPaths, that really lets you zone in and tell a story around data and indicators, making sure you can make the case for why this is relevant. I think some of it as well is a lack of understanding. So again, I see this as a place where the current project can really help by highlighting that not all indicators or outcomes or impacts should be expected of all RIs. So I think there's an education piece, there's a dialogue piece, and then there's a compromise piece where we simply have to do the best we can, but make sure that we're adding context so that things aren't misconstrued. I hope that answers a little bit your question.
Thank you, Lara. There is a second question which fits very well with this discussion about the language and the importance of constructing, building a bridge between the different communities. So I'm giving the floor to Claudia Allen Amaro, who has a question on the issue of language.
Thank you, Silvia. I was very pleased to hear that the issue of language and how specific our vocabulary is has been mentioned. Research infrastructure have a whole new vocabulary for all their activities, all what they measure, and this is difficult for many stakeholders, and in particular difficult for our funding bodies and government officials to really understand what we are doing if we are using different vocabulary. In the project RISI, which is a project that deals with visibility of research infrastructure, a group of very specialized communicators work very hard in developing a toolkit for communication to help with this. Then I thought that this is a clear synergy between the two projects, and I was wondering if there have been any interactions between the two projects, the two kits, to go forward and make use, at least between ourselves, we are using the same vocabulary, and if the communicators can come up with better alternatives to help our communication, specifically for impact, that can happen.
Yes, we've been working pretty much in the project with the issue of language, and we also have communication expert, but I will give to Alice there the chance to reply in more details on this point.
Yes, thanks, Sylvia. Thank you, Claudia, for the question. I think indeed the language has been a challenge. I mean, we started off as a partnership thinking we all talk the same language, and I think we spent the first 6 months discussing what certain terms meant. and understanding. And I think that was a very rich process, and sometimes we never quite came to blows about it, of course. But I mean, it was sometimes, you know, people had really strong opinions about what one term or word or concept meant, and I do think it is fundamental, first of all, within the RI community itself, to understand what we mean by impact. So I think some people still will focus very much on scientific impact and won't necessarily look beyond that, and I think that they then miss huge potential to promote and strengthen the case for their RI in the future, in terms of future upgrading or investment. But also between RI managers, RI stakeholders, and the policy-making community, but then also, as I mentioned earlier, towards the general public. So, you know, if you go to the CERN website or which is, you know, very strong messaging around certain types of impacts, which otherwise remain quite difficult for the general public to understand. So I think this whole question of communication is at different levels. And again, within the ESFRI work and KPIs, we had several KPIs around the communication issue, which I worked on myself in terms of the detailed proposals for that within the overall publication. So I think there's really an issue. In terms of contacts between the projects, I believe we've had contacts with RIVIS. We've certainly been following you on Twitter and vice versa. I think my colleague Alina, who's not with us today, but who's been very active in terms of contacts between the projects, has had contact with RIVIS. And then I would say also the tool I just showed you, so the online tool, which will be available shortly, we've developed it very much as open source and Creative Commons framework. So the idea is that this is not something set in stone, because we believe, first of all, that you know, we don't have all the answers to everything. This is an evolving practice. The piloting we've done, including the 4, but we've done with a couple of others as well, in addition, with the 4 RIs in the project, but a couple of more, gives us some additional insight. But we think there's a lot of case material, and as Frederick said, I think that's one of the things we need to really build up as a sort of, as a community, is this understanding of what's been done by who so far. And that also helps to develop that common language. So our platform, our toolkit will be, you know, very much, you know, collaborative, open source, Creative Commons approach in the future. So we're hoping that such cooperation can be developed with ongoing current projects, but also future initiatives of Commission, the OECD, member states, ESFRI, etc. So I think we really do need to build that community of practice as broadly as possible, and that we all talk the same language. Sylvia.
Okay, I see that there is still one question in the question and answer session, and there is also a raised hand. So I think we have time to accommodate both the requests. So I'm now giving the floor to Daniel Orestein, who has a question which is primarily addressed to ESFRI, but also to the other panelists. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. I'm a part of the European Long-Term Ecological Research Network, which just joined the ESFRI framework, the ESFRI roadmap this year. And as part of our responsibility over the next 5 years, we also have to set up a framework for socio-economic benefit assessment and also cost-benefit analysis. And listening to the first seminar a couple days ago, I emerged with a really confident feeling that we're going to be assessed in very pluralistic terms. That is, on our own, the way we define ourselves, the way what we have already suggested we can offer the community. And I want to make sure that I'm not overly confident emerging from that, and ask if that is indeed the case, that when you analyze our own self-assessment, whether you take into account how we define our success, how we define our contribution, and also if you could speak to the trade-off between the monetary analysis and the general kind of indicators analysis, and whether you look at both of those in conjunction, or because we're planning on submitting in both terminologies. Thank you very much.
Okay, so yeah.
I cannot escape from this question. Even so, I have to start with a disclaimer again, because we've had last week we have had an ESFRI forum where we have been discussing about how to implement the recommendations from the ad hoc working group on monitoring and indicators, which was already often referred to, and which particularly is related to the question. And we did not yet find an agreement in the forum. So everything I'm saying here is my personal opinion, and I'm not afraid or shy to say that, because I think we have in ESFRI a huge responsibility to push things forward. And among all the practical issues which are related to project evaluations, to proposal evaluations, to evaluations of the landmarks, to monitoring, to the various assessments we are eventually contributing to, I have a clear opinion that we shall also consider the administrative burden. And one of the roles, and this is the difficult part because we are speaking policy, but with the perspective of politics, is the alignment issue. And I see as an ideal assessment procedure in ESFRI terms and semi-automated process where all our methodologies are somehow implemented, so a kind of tool similar to that which is going to be proposed by ERPAS, and where everybody can feed in information, and where everybody, depending on the access right, can retrieve information from, which in principle would then mean that we would emphasize a little bit the positive formative aspects of evaluation. Because, I mean, a part of the situation that there are internal managerial processes which require some data, they are reporting processes for the funders, there are requests from the national governments, there are requests from ESFRI, from the European Commission, there from the different grant agencies, and so on. And in principle, you in fact need an entire department, even in a very small research infrastructure, just to comply with that. And quite often there is an overlap, and there is a lack of standards, and both would possibly, without affecting the competencies of the different players, help to reduce this burden if aligned. And this is the way or direction I am trying to guide the discussion in ESFRI a little bit, because I see there a huge potential. And of course, and if you go then to the recommendations and to the report of the monitoring group, you will find clear sentences pointing to this direction. And I mean, so I don't have an answer to your question, but in principle and in a very ideal world, these performance indicators shall be commonly aligned and determined for a particular case, and everybody shall be let's say yeah, if not happy, then at least shall have a clear understanding that this is something which is useful, which is technically. I'm losing the connection. I'm sorry for that. But anyhow, we are approaching the end. So I guess this is a way where then seemingly the discrepancies you are addressing between internal needs and internal evaluation processes, internal managerial principles, and the external requests on monitoring or performance or evaluation seemingly disappear or are getting at least closer to each other. And I still hope that at least within S3 and within S3 infrastructures, we can achieve that very soon. And then similarly to the road mapping process, where the first S3 roadmap has been established back in 2006. And just 2-3 years after, half of the European countries has started to develop roadmaps of research infrastructures. With this role model, we can really contribute to closer integration of European research policies, not only at the policy level, but also in practical means in processes of monitoring and evaluation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. If I can add something also on this discussion, I mean, the idea, because you mentioned the participant, that the question was about a possible trade-off between the assessment in monetary terms and the assessment against the missions of the RI. I think that what RI Path has also brought about as a key lesson is that we can perhaps go a little bit beyond the traditional idea of existing trade-off between different types of methodologies. So typically there is a discussion about the more qualitative or quantitative kind of assessment. I think that the project also demonstrates that a good combination of different approaches and methodologies is a good way to provide a comprehensive assessment. So I would not go for the direction of trade-offs between, so if you have more in monetary terms, then you have less in other terms. It can be a good combination. You have to look at all the different aspects, of course. So I see that unfortunately there are still a couple of questions and a raised hand. Perhaps we won't have the time to address all of them. I would ask Alejandro Sanchez, who has a raised hand, to very quickly perhaps pose the very last question for the time that we have left for this session. Please, Alejandro, the floor is yours. Alejandro?
Yes, hello. This is
okay.
Gaston Garcia I'm Alejandro's colleague.
Okay.
From Madrid Autonomous University and collaborator of ALBA Synchrotron.
I have another meeting, but I wish you all the best.
So,
sorry.
Yeah. So my question is about the following: when engaged in this project, when one looks at the different pathways and how complex they may be, and having in mind the background such as LEAPS, so this League of European Accelerator-Based Photon Sources, so a number of facilities which work in similar challenges from different countries in Europe, one sees that frequently some of the most interesting impacts, like for example innovation ones, may be traced back in an incremental way to multiple contributions. For example, if we have a major innovation impact in 10 years from now, one can trace back and see that it started at some preliminary experiment at Diamond Light Source, then went on at ALBA, and maybe matured at DESY, ESRF, or the European XFEL. And then, of course, there is a problem of attribution. And one wonders, and I'm asking if you're aware of some initiative, of some move in the direction of considering impact assessment from the scope point of view of not single individual facilities, but from the point of view of a large number of facilities which tackle the same type of problems. Are you aware of some effort in this direction? Do you think it's an idea that maybe could be elaborated?
Laura, perhaps, do you have a view on that?
Sure, I'm happy to chime in. It's not directly an example where this happens, but for several years now, we've looked more at a contribution model rather than an attribution model, because exactly what you say is the case. Even if it's not different RIs, there are always different contributions made that allow impact, especially that long-term impact, to happen from science. The arena has to be right, there has to be uptake of the evidence, there has to be replication. So all these things do require different players and different actors along that pathway. So I think looking at contribution rather than attribution is preferred from my perspective, but how we do it and how we make sure we get those different players engaged in a study or a project looking at the impact is still a challenge, I think.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think that the time is over now, Alasdair, if I'm not wrong. Unfortunately, there are still some questions, but perhaps we can address them in the next webinars, perhaps. So I invite everybody to join also the next webinar.
Yeah, just maybe to close, so I can see the two questions. So just quickly, perhaps give an answer from the project side to the two questions. So one from Jennifer Baird on planned and secondary impacts. I would say that that's been really a core part of the process we've been running during the project with the participants to the different workshops, is to trace out from, for instance, an RI that's doing fundamental research, to be able to trace out what could be the potential routes to an innovation impact, even from, as an example, I'm currently looking at the European Spatial Observatory. As also, that's very, fundamental research, observatories on tops of mountains in Chile and in the Canary Islands. So how do you then look for the sort of innovations that could come out of that type of research? And there are ways of doing it, and there are ways of building up impact cases, and it's been something we've really tried to build in to the toolkit. And on the question from Olaf Schwarzkopf, in terms of the sort of timing or time span, again, it was a topic that came up a lot in the discussions, because again, some of the impacts, and I think, again, that's why I think this whole kind of policy or life cycle approach to thinking about impacts is important, is that you can have impacts as an RI even in the well, you definitely have impacts as an RI in the construction phase or even in the design phase, and waiting to start trying to work out what your impacts might be until you're in operation will actually limit the potential impact on the economy and society. So, for instance, the way you commission or procure inputs, equipment, etc., for the RI in the construction phase can have huge impacts on innovation in terms of, for instance, if you put it out as a more innovative public procurement for the development of a new instrument, as opposed to buying something off the shelf from a major existing vendor. So you can actually stimulate innovation within the smaller company sector. So I think that's that whole question of time span of keeping the view on the life cycle or the whole cycle of investment into an RI is extremely important, and I think that's one of the key lessons that we draw out of the work. To close, perhaps I'll just put up the last slide where you can see our website. You can see how you can contact us via the email, but also follow us on Twitter. And there's also a LinkedIn group which you're welcome to join. As I mentioned, the toolkit, which I gave you a sort of sneak preview of in terms of the way it will be structured and look, will be available in the coming weeks. We'll make sure that all participants to this webinar get information when that becomes available. And similarly with the guidebook, which is short, easy to read, we hope. It's being edited currently, but both for layout and for clarity of language, will also be available for download, and along with all the other deliverables, obviously, which we've done produced throughout the life of the project. And just to close, I would say This has been very much about working with the community. It's been about building a community of practice from the level of RI managers to policymakers and decision makers about future funding into RIs at different levels, European, national, international levels. And I think we hope as a consortium team, along with our advisory board and other partners, to maintain that community practice in the future. So thank you for following this webinar. As I said, it will be available as a recorded version online as soon as we do the usual tricks to make it into a version we can upload. And there's a third webinar on Monday, 10 o'clock. You can still register for that, and you'll be able to have a more detailed insight into the cases that we, the trialed pilot cases, we trialed the methods on with different approaches. So each of the RIs adopted different approaches and different impact pathways to examine in their piloting exercises. So a lot of learning, which we tried again to capture in the guidebook, which we're finalizing from the pilot exercises as well. So thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to Sylvia for moderating as well along with me. Thank you to all the participants, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and hope to catch up in person as soon as the current lockdown is over. I know there'll be a big event in Canada next year, the ECRI conference, which Laura and her colleagues are hoping, which was planned for September, which is now next year. So hopefully we'll all be able to meet up at such events in the coming months. Again, thank you for your participation, and see you soon. Bye-bye.